Good morning, oyster catchers, again. Last week before half term, so we've worked really hard and we're looking forward to this one. Really getting involved with Tom's Midnight Garden now. And I asked you on Friday to read the first part of chapter 13, the late Miss Bartholomew, down to where it said her aunt was a disagreeable woman. Now, as you know, in this first part of the chapter, Tom was planning to sort of visit Mrs. Bartholomew and try and find out a little bit about the history of the house. So we'll continue to read this morning. So the story, in Tom's imagination, rolled on. It became confused and halting where Tom himself did not already know the facts. But after all, he would only have to pay his call upon Mrs. Bartholomew to hear it from her own lips. She would perhaps end her story, he thought, with a dropping of her voice. And since then, Tom, they say that she and her garden and all the rest haunt this house. They say that all those who are lucky may go down about when the clock strikes for midnight and open what was once the garden door and see the ghost of the garden and of the little girl. Tom's mind ran on the subject. His cold was getting so much better now that his aunt and uncle had insisted on coming to sit with him to keep him company. One day, hardly speaking aloud, Tom began a sentence. When Mr. Bartholomew lived in this house... But I don't think Mr. Bartholomew ever did live here, said Aunt Gwen. Do you, Alan? Uncle Alan did not answer at first, being in the depths of a chess problem in which he had failed to interest Tom. But Aunt Gwen, Tom protested, this was his family home. How else would he have known the history of this house, and the ghost stories too? How else could he ever have told Mrs. Bartholomew? Why, Tom, said his aunt in bewilderment. Mr. Bartholomew, whoever he was, never lived in this house. Uncle Alan now said positively. Mrs. Bartholomew was a widow when she came here, and that wasn't so many years ago either. But what about the clock? What clock? The grandfather clock in the hall. You said it belonged to Mrs. Bartholomew, but that clock has always been in this house. It was here long, long ago. It was here when the house had a garden. Now, what reason do you have for supposing all this, Tom? Asked Uncle Alan. He spoke less sharply than usual because he really thought the boy must be feverish. Tom was searching in his mind for an explanation that yet would not give away his secret, when his aunt came unexpectedly to his rescue. You know, Alan, the clock certainly must have been here a long time because of its screws at the back of having rusted into the wall. Well now, Tom, that might explain a little, said Uncle Alan. He patted Tom's hand as it lay on the counterpane to soothe him. The clock may well have been here a long time, as you say, and during that time the screws rusted up. After that happened, the clock couldn't be moved without danger of damaging it. But when old Mrs. Bartholomew came, she had to buy the clock with the house. You see, Tom, it's all quite straightforward if you reason it out. From that time, abruptly, Tom ceased to hope for anything from Mrs. Bartholomew. The possibility of Hattie's being a ghost stayed in his mind, however, at the back of his mind. He was not even aware of the presence of the idea until one day in the garden it became the cause of a quarrel with Hattie herself. It was the only real quarrel that ever took place between them. They were beginning to build their treehouse in the steps of St. Paul's, as usual. Tom was directing, while Hattie did the work of pulling and plaiting branches together to make the walls. The floor of old pieces of boarding that Hattie had found in the potting shed was already in place. Hattie, as she worked, was singing to herself from hymns and songs and ballads. Now she was singing the end of the ballad of Sweet Molly Malone. Her ghost wheels her barrow through streets broad and narrow, singing cockles and mussels alive, alive-o. And Hattie continued to hum and murmur under her breath the refrain. Alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh. Suddenly Tom said, he blurted it out before he could help himself, "What's it like? I mean, I wonder what it's like to be dead and a ghost." Hattie stopped singing at once and looked at him slyly over her shoulder and laughed. Tom repeated the question. "What's it like to be a ghost?" "Like?" said Hattie. She turned fully to face him and laid a hand upon his knee and looked eagerly into his face. "Ah, tell me, Tom." For a moment Tom didn't understand her. Then he jumped to his feet and shouted, "I'm not a ghost!" "Don't be silly, Tom," Hattie said. "You forget that I saw you go right through the orchard door when it was shut." "That proves what I say," said Tom. "I'm not a ghost, but the orchard door is, and that was why I could go through it. The door's a ghost and the garden's a ghost. So are you too." "Indeed I'm not. You are." They were glaring at each other now. Hattie was trembling. "You're a silly little boy," she said, and Tom thought resentfully that this seemed to have been growing up a good deal too much recently. "And you make a silly little ghost. Why do you think you wear those clothes of yours? None of my cousins ever played in the garden in clothes like that. Such outdoor clothes can't belong to nowadays. I know such clothes." "They're my pyjamas," said Tom indignantly. "My best visiting pyjamas. I sleep in them, and this is my bedroom slipper." His second slipper had been left as usual to wedge the flat door upstairs. "And you go about so in the daytime, always in your night clothes," said Hattie scornfully. "And it's the fashion nowadays, is it, to wear only one slipper? Really, you are silly to give such excuses. You wear strange clothes that no one wears nowadays because you're a ghost. Why, I'm the only person in the garden who sees you. I can see a ghost." Hattie would never believe the real explanation of his clothes, and Tom chose what he thought was a shorter counter-argument. "Do you know, I could put my hand through you now, just as if you weren't there." Hattie laughed. I could, shouted Tom. She pointed at him. "You're a ghost." In a passion, Tom hit her a blow upon his outstretched wrist. There was a great force of will as well as muscle behind the blow, and his hand went right through. Not quite as through thin air, for Tom did feel something, and Hattie snatched back at her wrist and nursed it in her other hand. She looked as if she might cry, but that could not have been for any pain, for the sensation hadn't been strong enough. In a wild defence of herself, Hattie still gloated. "Your hand didn't go through my wrist went through your hand. You're a ghost with a cruel, ghostly hand." "Do you hear me?" Tom shouted. "You're a ghost, and I've proved it. You're dead and gone, and a ghost." There was a quietness then, in which could be heard a cuckoo's stuttering cry from the wood beyond the garden, and then the sound of Hattie's beginning softly to weep. "I'm not dead. Please, Tom, I'm not dead." Now that the shouting had stopped, Tom was not sure of the truth, after all, but only sure that Hattie was crying, as he had never seen her cry since she had been a very little girl, wearing mourning black and weeping her way along the sundial path, weeping for death so early. He put his arm round her. "All right then, Hattie, you're not a ghost. I take it all back, all of it. Only don't cry." He calmed her, and she consented at last to dry her tears and go back to plaiting the branches, only sniffing occasionally. Tom did not reopen a subject that upset her so deeply, although he felt that he owed it to himself to say sometime later, "Mind you, I'm not a ghost either." This, by her silence, Hattie seemed to allow. Okay, today's session, I'd like you to have a look at the very first part of chapter 14. It's called The Pursuit of Knowledge, and we're going to do some handwriting. Just make sure that our careful cats are in place and that we're taking a pride in our work. Okay, so read the instructions and off we go. Have a great day. Bye-bye.